Thank you very much, Maghiel, for this very interesting lecture you gave on ballad poetry. We should see the cartoon still. You've answered a lot of the questions I had, and I hope there's still a few questions in the audience as well, but I do have a few left. It's interesting to see also how powerful, you mentioned the power of poetry in China, and it is very powerful also outside of China. And you mentioned 3Ds about the work and the things that ballad poets write about. It's dirty, dangerous, and in meaning. And I would say it's just something that came up while I was listening to you, that I have 3 Ps for what the poetry is, so maybe a 4th, but let's keep it to 3. It's powerful, it's personal, it's political.
Well, it's powerful and it's personal and political, to be sure, and I wouldn't go as far as saying that there is a direct effect of particularly this poetry on, let's say, socio-economic policy in the People's Republic of China, but I would probably place it in a larger context that runs all the way from deliberation to outright protest. Right? There's a lot of labor unrest incidents that are actually recorded and documented by the Chinese government, and this information is publicly available in China throughout the year. And let me make one thing quite clear. In a subject like this, even if you're supposed to be a clinical academic, it's easy to get carried away. And it's easy to perhaps send a message. I hope I didn't do that, but if I did so, I should probably set things straight now. It's easy to imply or to suggest, perhaps, that there is some wicked mechanism of not wanting to help these people at work, that there is a morally wrong type of government in China that makes it its business to make life hard for people. And I do not for a minute believe that that is the case. I think it would be a pretty big challenge to run a country like China and to run socio-economic policy in a country like China. I certainly wouldn't know how to do it. And I think the choice, the impossible choice that the Chinese government is faced with, is on the one hand the desire, which was a real desire, and it has proved real over the last half-century or so, of improving socio-economic situation of the country, of improving life expectancy, of improving the material standard of living, of improving higher education, and the rest of it, on the one hand. In other words, this means you need to make money, right? And you need to do this in a context of global capitalism. And on the other hand, the desire to provide a livable environment for its citizens, including the precarious workers. Now, for example, there are museums about these people. There are Dagong museums. There are 4 that I know of. One I wasn't able to visit because it was closed and it hasn't reopened since. But there is one in Pitun, in that migrant worker home in the NGO. So this is kind of a shoestring budget, do-it-yourself effort. It's beautiful. And there are 2 in the south, in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, the 2 cities that are the most closely associated with China as the workshop of the world. Now, if you go to these museums, you see a political message that is very clear. And these museums are run by cultural authorities. In other words, this is the government talking. And that message is, these people are the foot soldiers of the economic miracle that has enabled China to become a geopolitical player. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That argument holds water. What these museums do less of, and this has been observed by researchers in China and in other places, is to actually sort of level with the moment of the individual experience of the individual precarious worker, right? There is hardship, but in many ways it remains an abstraction. Whereas in the poetry, and in some of the autobiographical fiction writing and non-fiction writing, and in some of the reportage literature and some of the investigative journalism, we actually see stories that are absolutely heart-wrenching and that, you know, no government would want to look away from. So I guess it's hard to say that there's sort of a direct impact of this poetry on policy. Probably not. but this poetry sits in a tradition of an ongoing, extremely complex conversation inside the country and outside it.
Yeah, obviously, but it has a high documentary value as well. Another thing that I was wondering about is time-wise. I mean, these people are working very hard at this assembly line. I don't know how many hours a day, just working hard, being tired. Where do you find, the time and the energy to write poetry?
Well, this question is right on the money. It's something that various people have reflected upon in scholarship, and I think there are two elements to a possible answer. One is that poetry is an art form that is easily done in materially difficult circumstances. So this also holds, for example, for underground literature. A lot of underground literature, not just in China but elsewhere, is poetry. Why? Because, it tends to be short. You can carry it around, you can memorize it sometimes. Some people know how to memorize this. Some people actually survive by memorizing poetry. There's a story of a Soviet-Russian translator from the French, I forget his name now, who was sent to one of the camps, one of the labor camps, and actually survived because he had memorized endless amounts of poetry by Baudelaire, and because he translated this stuff from memory and sort of built this translation project throughout his year.
So it kept him sane.
It kept him sane. Well, Primo Levi has said this about Auschwitz, right? The power of poetry, of children's rhymes, even to stay alive. So poetry is an art form that is easily done, even if you've got nothing, and perhaps you just need a pen and paper or a smartphone. It fits in your back pocket. You could do it in half an hour. Easier than a novel. The other answer is that I think it is precisely that exhaustion, and I can tell you about the shifts because the number of hours is actually mentioned in various poems, and a poem by Multhal, one of the poems on screen here today, mentions 16-hour shifts. Okay, this is not unheard of. Somebody like Zheng Xiaoqiong in that same interview told me that they had 12-hour shifts, and then they would add as much overtime as possible because they were trying to make money for their family back home. So she would work 14 hours, that kind of thing. But I think it is precisely that utter exhaustion that sort of forces you to find time where there is none because of the powerful drive behind it. So here you can turn that American English idiom, actually, you can turn it into reality and say, write poetry like there's no tomorrow. Because in a precarious existence, that's what it is. There is no tomorrow, right? You don't know what things are going to be like down the line.
Time's relevant, I guess. Yeah. One more question before I give you the chance to ask a few questions if you have some. And now I forgot my question. It'll come back to me, see. It's time for you to have...
I can still answer it.
Oh, that'd be good. Interesting. These academics. Anyways, anyone, a question, please.
I was wondering whether there is any connection between the foreign poets in China with the slam poetry practitioners here.
No.
I see some kind of activism also in slam poetry.
Yeah, I don't think, thank you for your question. I don't think there's a connection with slam poetry as such. There's not even much of a connection with spoken word. So to sort of, look at that a bit more broadly, but there is a horizontal connection, if you will, with other worker poetries, other places where, for example, poetry is used as a means of establishing solidarity between people in precarious positions. There's an American author who is he's a poetry activist. His name is Mark Nowak, N-O-W-A-K. And he wrote a book in 2020 called Social Poetics. And it's about the use of poetry in workshops to address all kinds of, issues, problems, not just issues of social justice, but also trauma and working with underprivileged children, for example. And Mark Novak has a chapter on that migrant worker NGO based in Pitun, out of Beijing. I don't think he traveled there, but he certainly read about this stuff and wrote a chapter about it. So there is a horizontal connection. For example, one of the editors of the journal that I mentioned that is called Workers' Poetry, published these days, or unofficially published, we have this on the website, is somebody who is extremely knowledgeable about foreign to China, right? Foreign traditions in workers' poetry the world over. And so he uses translation software and dictionaries and whatnot to translate what he finds in the way of essays and poetry sometimes, and posts this on WeChat, which is, the social media app, or one of the two social media apps, the most important social media apps in China. So I don't think there's a direct connection with slam poetry, but I certainly know that there are horizontal connections with, let's say, other communities of solidarity through literature and through poetry.
Anyone else? Sorry, in the back and then.
So you mentioned that so in the 1950s you had the more traditional socialist poetry where the worker was really seen as a higher ideal, and how exactly did that then transition into the current battle poetry from the 1950s to the 1980s?
Yeah, have you got a couple of days? But it's, again, it's a very good question. So one thing I didn't talk about in the lecture, simply because I was looking at the clock, but this poetry in the high socialist era, it's absolutely fascinating because the worker is a dignified political subject, right? The worker in political rhetoric at that time is actually the master of the nation, right? This is the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the proletariat, and this is not a bad word, right? It's a great, wonderful, beautiful, glorious word, right? The 无产阶级, the class without the means of production. And actually what was happening in practice is that a lot of what we know about worker poetry from that time is about texts that weren't written by actual workers, but were written by party cadres sent by the Communist Party to work with the workers and sort of, as ghost riders, if you will, work with the community. The same thing happened in the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s when this was happening in the countryside, where farming villages and communities were asked to contribute to the production of steel, which meant they, basically had to screw up agriculture, and they had to write poetry. Again, the importance of poetry in politics in China as well. So lots of highly educated, Communist Party affiliated intellectuals went down, this is actually the expression, to the countryside to work with the peasants and sort of write poetry with them. Now, as for the transition, this is basically a question about socio-economic policy. So, the proletariat is a dignified political subject with good social security, medical insurance and stuff like that. Really still depends on where you look in the country, but basically you're in a good place. With socio-economic reforms starting in the late 1970s under Zheng Xiaoqiong and then continuing and sort of taking off in the 1980s, came the dismantling of the social security system and came the dismantling of lifetime employment. And that's where we move into the stage of the precariat, the precarious labourers. You can't call this a class because a social class presupposes some sort of organisation, political organisation, whereas in China, as in other places in this neoliberal global capitalist world, what we see is atomization of the people with, without the means of production, the people without socio-economic security. So it is a sea change, and your question sort of, puts the finger on that. And to many people in China, it is very hard to imagine and align themselves with, precisely because of the sheer depth of this sea change, of the fact that somebody who is a worker, right, which used to be a proud epithet, could be turned into, well, not the lowest of the low, but something pretty close when you look at the situation in which many of these precarious workers operate. So it is a true sea change, yes.
There was a question in front here.
What's the role of religion in this story?
The role of religion in this poetry, not a great deal as far as I can see. There is certainly a place for religion in Chinese poetry throughout the ages. So there's a lot of, let's say, easily traceable Buddhism and Taoism, not to mention Confucianism, in classical poetry, for example, classical Chinese poetry. We haven't talked about classical Chinese poetry today, but we could. And then in modern poetry, you see much less of this. Now, the fact that, this is actually not a fact, the non-fact that, that China is, according to some, an atheist country, I mean, that is as far as the truth as could be. Popular religion is huge in China, and this includes, for example, popular Taoism, a lot of Buddhism, lived Buddhism, that sort of thing. There are poetries. Not so long ago, I was in touch with somebody in the context of our project, of the unofficial publications, who said, listen, we have this collection of new Buddhist poetry published in the 90s. Can I send you a copy? And he said, yes, please, right, so we can have this in our library. But in battler poetry, I haven't seen a lot of religion. Perhaps accepting the occasional reference to a fairly abstract God.
I remember my question. It's about the popularity of the battler poems, poetry in China itself, and with whom? I mean, who reads? Is it other workers who read the poems of their fellow workers, their fellow poets? Or how far is the popularity? How far does it stretch? Who reads the poetry in China?
Yeah, I'm glad you've remembered your question now. Let's hope I can remember my answer. But yes, fellow workers, but again, there you could see really interesting discrepancies. And I talked a lot about complexity, that's because it's my business to talk about complexity, but also because, you see this in the autobiographical essays written by Xiaoqiong, for example. He says how at one point he's in a factory, and they're all working their heads off, and he's really crazy about poetry. And so he, when they have a tea break or whatever, or a cigarette break, he sits his fellow workers down, and he wants to tell them about Li Bai, right, the great Tang poet, or Tofu, and then he wants to tell them about Allen Ginsberg's Howl in San Francisco, or he wants to tell them about his poetry, and his workmates kind of look at him like he's from another planet and say, well, yeah, okay, what does this have to do with us? Right, so no connection. At the same time, blogs like Zheng Xiaoqiong's and social media poetry is read widely, and this reading certainly includes fellow workers, and that is why, if I had to say, for example, why these four poetries, right, battler poetry, the US and the UK, high socialist poetry and dotted poetry, what they have in common, the first thing I would say is this is about identification. It's about community building. It's about hearing a story that you can relate to and say, that's me, right? I want to say this as well. But then the interesting thing about battler poetry is, and before going into any of this, we should know that modern poetry is basically inherently marginal, right? It's marginal everywhere. Right? We have a great crowd here tonight, but if my lecture had been on, I don't know, socio-economic policy or whatever, ChatGPT, then we would have probably had 250 people. Not sure, but maybe.
You wouldn't have written your lecture yourself.
No, that's right. I wouldn't have written myself. So you see that in taking that into account, battler poetry actually travels sometimes a bit further than, let's say, your regular professional poetry, precisely because it can speak to such a variety of audiences. So there's labor activists in Hong Kong and in China itself and outside the Chinese world who use this poetry in what you call the documentary way. Well, these people translate in a way that is strictly instrumental, right? So they translate very differently than somebody like Sylvia would translate, who I imagine, or I know for a fact, struggles with that entanglement of the aesthetic impulse and the moral impulse and the linguistic impulse, etc., right? So in fact, it is relatively visible, and one of the interesting things is I have found that this is not about me. I'm not trying to make this about me, but this comes from my experience. I've been in Chinese poetry for a long time, and I've always lectured about it, but I've never worked with a topic for which I get so many invitations, right, to talk about as battle poetry. That is because of that socio-economic connection, and I think that's fine and great and wonderful. And you saw, when Iron Moon came out, that anthology in America in 2016-17, it was actually covered in a major national newspaper in the Netherlands. I have never seen any English language anthology, multiple author anthology of contemporary Chinese poetry being covered in a Dutch national newspaper. But this one was.
Any other question? Yes, sir.
Is there a lot of variation in the poems? Because the translations, it's all quite similar for me, but I think there's in the Chinese language there's a lot of things I don't understand.
Yeah, but I would hope that the problem here wasn't one of translation. So I don't know. I'm not sure that I agree. So what I could do is I brought a copy. So. I'm gonna give you my copy. You don't need to read it now, but take it home and have a look. I actually think these four voices are fairly different. They have a different tone of voice. The poem by Xiaohai is lyrical, right? You owe your friend an expectation, you owe your lover an eternity. The poem by Zheng Xiaoqiong is almost trance-like, somebody sitting at the assembly line, moving along with the products on the assembly line. The poem by Mu Cao is bitingly sarcastic. It's actually his trademark. And who was number 4? Xu Lizhi. That very sort of meager, trimmed down, stripped image of this crew plunging to the ground, etc. But anyway, have another look, and you can find me online, so I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Anyone else? You still have the opportunity to talk to Maghiel and Sylvia if you want, and share us for a drink or a little bite or something.
Buy the book.
And buy the book. First buy the book, then come and join us. No, just joking. If there aren't any more questions, I think we can wrap it up. What do you think? Thank you very much for coming to this event. Thank you, Maghiel, for your lecture again. Thanks for the translation.